Welcome, everyone, to DEI After 5, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator, and coach, Sacha Thompson.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this episode of DEI After 5. Now, for those of you who don't know, I want to tell you a little secret. I was not born in the United States. Go figure, right? If you followed me for any amount of time, you know that my family is from the Caribbean. And so I've always had this very different cultural lens of the work that I do and how I see the world and how it's shaped how I approach this work. And so as I continue to do this work and meet other folks that are from other parts of the country doing this work, other parts of the world, I should say, doing this work, I really started to think about the globalization of DEI and what that looks like outside of the United States. Because so many of the companies that are in the US are really focusing kind of on the US, but this is something that is very global. And so my conversation today is really going to be focused on that, right? It's the globalization of DEI. And so my guest today is Abbiola Ballah, who is a DEI consultant who also is from the Caribbean. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. So Abbiola, welcome.
Hi, Sacha. It's nice to be here.
Nice to have you. So for those who may not know who you are or what you do, can you just give us a little bit of your background?
Yeah. So, hi, everyone. I'm Abbiola Ballah, and I am an equity and inclusion consultant and mentor and speaker. I am originally, as Sacha mentioned, I'm originally from the Caribbean. I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago. But I've lived the majority of my adult life outside of Trinidad. So I've lived in Japan for 10 years. I lived in the US for a long time, in New York, in California, and I also lived in Belize. So it's been a whirlwind of living all over the world for me. And, I am an educator. So my career started in education way back 17 plus years ago, right? And I was a teacher in Japan for a long time, a curriculum and program designer. And I also moved into working in higher ed, working in the social impact space. And, through everything that I did, through all of that, it was all through this lens of anytime I want someone comes into my space, I want them to feel like they belong, because I know what it feels like to be different, because I was always the one in a room, the only one from the Caribbean, the only one person of color, the only one of mixed ethnicity, I was always that one. And I always wanted to make sure in my spaces, in my classrooms, in workshops that I facilitated, that people didn't feel like they were the one, but that they were a part of. So all the lesson plans, the program design, curriculum design, always had that through line of DEI. And even before I even knew what it was, I was doing this. So it's only until I think a few years ago, maybe when I say a few years, I mean like 6 years, 7 years ago. That's a few. That I kind of moved into really honing in on what DEI is and what the theory behind it and what this means. And a lot of what I've learned was from the US context. So for me, now I had to start pulling out of it. Okay, what does it mean for me? What does it mean for my work? What does it mean for me being in Japan? What does it mean for me living in Belize? And working with people from all walks of life, from all different, across all borders, right? Not just country borders, but like state borders, community borders, like socioeconomic borders, things like that. So, and that's where, Fern Education Studios became a thing.
Right.
And I started this entrepreneur life of, working specifically in equity and inclusion consulting, with professionals and organizations who are working across borders trying to make an impact. So that's in a nutshell me.
I love it. I love it. Because when we first, had our first conversation, that's what I gravitated toward, because I was like, oh, she gets it. Like,
Yes.
I've always been accustomed to being that lonely only and having to live within several cultures.
Yeah.
And so, especially for those whose families have immigrated to the United States, that is something, immigrated to the United States. It's something that people are pretty accustomed to, right? Like, you have your culture at home, but then you go out into the world and then you're dealing with that culture and that environment and having to balance and juggle that. And so I think it becomes very, almost like second nature to be able to do that, right? Some people call it code switching or culture switching. And having to understand those nuances. I think for me, what was really fascinating, that I was going through it, but I didn't understand what I was going through until I was older and had taken some sociology classes. And it's like, oh, there's a name for this thing that I've been doing my whole life. And so I think that it's a skill that we have, that many people have, that they can tap into as they look at the work that they do every single day. So I appreciate, that you've done this from an education standpoint and making sure that your students that were kind of like the lonely onlys weren't, right? Like, they were a collective, they were part of this larger community. And it's not that difficult if you are intentional about it.
That's it, right? Intentionality. You have to be, or else, what's the point?
Yeah. So I want to take us into a conversation specifically around the Caribbean, because I've noticed, and it's so interesting. I shared with you earlier, I recently went back to Barbados. My mom's there, my sister, a bunch of family members are there, and ended up, which was supposed to be kind of a getaway, I ended up having conversations with DEI folks, right? Conversations around diversity and inclusion. But what's so fascinating to me is, having these conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion in countries that are predominantly Black, right? And on top of that, the impacts of colonization, the impacts of the descendants of white settlers who are culturally, right, a part of that community, but many have not reconciled with how their families got to those islands. And so that part of diversity, equity, and inclusion that is not often talked about, but is so innate into the cultures. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about that. And, how do countries that are predominantly Black, right, have these conversations? I'm gonna start there because I have so many other questions in my head. But how do we start having or unpacking what diversity, equity, and inclusion looks like in these spaces?
Yeah. So everything you said, man, I can relate. I've been having some of these conversations myself. And one of the things I've noticed is that there is a lack of awareness that this is even a thing that they should think about. So usually when I tell family members like, hey, I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, they're like, a what? What does that even mean? Equity? Do you do something with like homes? I'm like, no.
Right, financial services? What are we talking about here?
Like, weren't you a teacher? Like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Right? And it's like having to break it down and kind of like really going back to like DEI 101 in terms of here's the definition, here's what diversity means, here's what equity means, here's what belonging is. You remember that feeling you felt when you were like, so it's really like the conversations have to start from that 101, that foundational phase, because so many people, they just don't, they've never thought about it in that way. And I think the other thing is, and I don't know if you get this, but when I do start to talk about it, just within my my family unit, my friends unit, my colleagues here, when I do start to talk about it, I get a lot of the times, oh, that's foreign people thing. No, it's not. It's actually, and for those listening, if you're not from the Caribbean, when they say foreign people, they mean anyone who is not from the Caribbean.
Right.
Not even just the island, just the Caribbean on a whole, right? But it's not, right? And so I think that it's sometimes a very uncomfortable conversation, a difficult conversation, but it's something that needs to be had. And I think for me, sometimes I bring it up when when something happens in the news, or when someone makes like a off comment about, someone in the, I'll give you an example. Like my uncle said to me the other day, he's like, those people. I'm like, what people? He's like, the people with all the letters. I'm like, what? I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Exactly. Do you mean the LGBTQIA plus community? And he's like, yeah. But it's not coming from a malicious place. It's just coming from that lack of awareness, that lack of knowledge, that lack of something that is not spoken. Right? Because so many things is like, you don't talk about it, but we need to talk about it.
It's so powerful because, the default is, and why I led with, these are predominantly Black or people of color countries, is because the default is, well, we have diversity. Why do we need to have this? Right? We're not trying to attract more people of color because we are the majority. And so there's a dismissive aspect of it there. And I was having a conversation with a friend, one of my sister's friends, who's an executive in a company that is based in Europe, but they have offices, in the Caribbean. And, in this conversation, she kind of said, she often gets dismissed because they're like, oh, you don't need to have that diversity conversation because, you represent the Caribbean, right? Y'all are good. And she's like, no, we actually do need to have this conversation, because if my team's not there, there's no other diversity at the table, right? And so what does that look like in that global context? And it goes beyond just skin color, right? And it's not just, and to understand the history of the Caribbean, there's so many cultures that are there, right? You have a huge number of Chinese descendants in the Caribbean. Trinidad has a huge Indian, Asian population
that are Venezuelan,
right? That are Trini. There's a Scottish and Irish population in Barbados as well. So, every island has this nuance, and that's not to say they're any more or less Bayesian or Trini or Jamaican or whatever, Haitian than anyone else. It's just that cultural nuance and understanding that history. That's not even to talk about the indigenous populations that were, driven out of these communities. And so I think it's important that we understand the histories of what's made the islands kind of what they are. But I think that that's important as we talk about this global context, and as companies that are based in the US or the UK or some of these larger areas, as they're looking at the Caribbean to have offices or, have teams, that's part of the beauty of the diversity within that region as well too. And so it's something that I think many companies need to take step back and take note of. But additionally, I think that many countries need to take a step back and look at the histories of how they became who they are and look at some ugly truths, right? As a part of that, you cannot talk about the history of the Caribbean or the Caribbean, however, people say it, without talking about the slave trade.
Can't.
Like
Just
you
I wouldn't be here.
You can't do it. You can't talk about, and again, this was a conversation that I was having, with my sister's friend of you can't talk about rum being a huge export of the Caribbean without talking about slavery.
Yep.
You can't. And so companies that are in those spaces, when you talk about sugar, you talk about cane, arrowroot for a while was a huge export of the Caribbean. You talk about bananas, or you talk about whatever it is that there's being exported out of the Caribbean. You can't do that and not have that conversation around slavery.
Yeah. Even Carnival. Where did that start?
Right.
It started with the slaves.
Right.
Right. So even something as, fun and vibrant as Carnival, and you come and you dance and you're ready to go.
Yes.
Where did that start?
Right. And so it's interesting as I have more and more of these conversations, particularly with folks that are West Indian, and part of that diaspora. It's how do we start to have those conversations? Because there's this mindset. I don't want to say if it's not broke, don't fix it. But why do we need to dwell on that, right? We're doing well now. But there's also challenges to not talking about that history because there's a lot of pain that's still there. Yep. And we talk about generational pain and trauma in this work that's still there, that needs to be tapped into. And not to tap into it just to say, oh my gosh, there's more pain, but you have to, okay, how do we start to work through this trauma?
Yeah, I 100% agree with everything you're saying. And I think one of the things is if we don't start tapping into these and having these conversations, just as you said, just about, the slavery and the indentured laborers and, the race side of things. How can we even start having conversations about the other parts of our identity if we don't? Right? Because I always tell people it's not just about race, yes, but it starts. Yeah. It starts there because we're not willing to. Exactly. We have to, and I think even within the Caribbean context, leaving, like when you said leaving them out of the conversation, they can't be because they have diversity in race, yes. But we also have diversity in gender, in sexual orientation, in our neurodivergence, in our body size. There's so many things that we still need to have conversations about. In our complexion, let's not even get started with colorism, right? Like, all of these things, if we're not willing to have that first conversation, that foundational conversation, we're never going to get to the other conversations that we need to have because it's like no one's going to want to talk about it. Everyone is like, you know what? It's like, as you said, and like, we don't need that. Let's put it over there. Like, especially the older generation. It's like we didn't grow up like that. That's a line I hear often, right?
We didn't
Or
have them when
that
you were growing up. I'm like, no, you probably did.
you did, right? And even more so now, where so much of the Caribbean is mixed, right? And everyone's, we're a little bit of everything now,
Mm-hmm.
and our families basically look like the diaspora of Trinidad.
Yeah.
So we have to have these conversations.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you touched on the colorism aspect of this, because that is something that I think is global, right?
Yeah.
And it's the impact of colonization on Black and brown bodies, right? And how there was this mental gymnastics that happened of, the lighter someone is, right, the better they are, and how that's been internalized through generations. Not just in the Caribbean, it happens in the US, it happens in the UK, it happens in, Asia, it happens globally. And so to have that common thread of, okay, colorism is really a thing, right? How do we start to unpack that? And I'm seeing it in different areas, but holistically, it's very difficult to do. But I think in having these conversations, that's a piece of this that needs to be brought to the forefront. Again, one of the conversations I had last week was someone talking about how they noticed how they were treated as compared to one of their siblings who was of lighter complexion, right? And how it happens within the same family.
Yeah.
So it's very real, and it's something, again, as we're having these diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations. How do you have that within cultures that don't necessarily see themselves as different, right?
That's the $1 million question right there.
It's interesting. And it's just so much to unpack. I have lots of conversations with my mom, who grew up in St. Vincent, but it's very British. Not as British as Barbados. Barbados is very British.
Pretty British.
Very British. But just unpacking things that she was taught that were correct versus, but I'm like, correct in whose eyes, right? Correct in British eyes. So is that a taking on of white supremacist culture as that's right? Or was it a way of stripping you from your cultural heritage so that you can be assimilated into this culture that makes you think that this is the correct way to live, right? So we have very interesting conversations, but
Sounds like it.
but it's this realization of, wow, okay, as you were saying, there's generations that this is what they've known, right? Many people were raised or grew up in very British colonies. Their countries haven't seen they've seen independence in their lifetime.
Yeah. Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. It was very interesting as you brought up independence. It was very interesting for me when I lived in Belize, because Belize, they saw independence in 1981. And not to like date myself here, but that was the year I was born.
Mm.
So for me, I'm like, this country is as old as I am.
Yeah.
What do you really know? And back then I was 38 or somewhere 37, 38 around the time I was living there. So I'm like, I'm still like figuring myself out. Imagine for a country that's just come out from underneath British rule.
Yeah.
And they're not even a republic yet. They're just independent, right? Two different scenarios, right?
Barbados just went through it, right?
Yeah, like they're now trying to figure out who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And through that, again, even the diversity within Belize is amazing. But then you have these little pockets of it's like the culture sometimes get, how do I say it? They kind of separate themselves. Like, this is the Maya culture, this is the this is the this is the this. And you're like, okay, but we're all Belizean. But what does that really mean? We're not right sure yet, but we're figuring it out.
Yeah.
You know, and I feel like a lot of it here in Trinidad is the same thing. It's like we're trying to say, yes, we're all Trinidadian, we're all one people, one culture, we're all the things. But that's at the surface. But when we start digging down, are we really, or are we still separating ourselves into these little buckets?
Yeah.
And when you go into a room and you're still the only person who's like of a darker complexion, how are you feeling in that room? When you go into a room and you're let's say a virtual room, like a Zoom room, and you're the only person that puts their pronouns up there, and everyone else is like, why did you do that? In the chat privately to you, and you have to answer that question over and over and over and over again because no one understands that. Or when you go in a room and they say, well, you wouldn't know, you lived outside for so long.
Yeah.
Right? But
you're not from here.
You're not from here, but you're not from there. So where am I from? Right? So all of these nuances. And that's why I always say, like, I tell people, like when people say to me, oh, well, inclusion, that should be easy, right? I'm like, do you understand the nuances that are a part of the work that we're doing? It's not this, like, I always feel like a broken record, right? It's not this checklist. It's not this like one and done thing. It's not cut and dried. Right. And it's also not something, I don't see it as the goal, because if it's a goal, it means we're going to accomplish it and we're going to have utopia.
It is a never ending journey.
It's a never ending journey. Exactly. Yeah. It's a journey. And I think, coming back to like the people here and just people working internationally, hearing that idea of it being a journey, for some people, that's the scariest thing you can tell them.
Yep.
Because they're like, well, and that's when it comes up, well, okay, well, maybe let's put this on the back burner.
Yeah, we don't have
time. We don't have time. Maybe, yeah, you guys really don't need to be in this conversation. You're good. You have some parts of it, right? Yeah. They don't want to dig deeper, right? Yeah. Go beyond just that surface.
It is so, it's just fascinating to me. And I want to do more work in this space. And to your point, for so long, I'm raised in the US, right? So I'm straight up American, though I didn't get my US citizenship until 2016 because I had this, my father kind of had in my head, like, you're a Bayesian and you're going to have your Bayesian citizenship. And, if you need to get out, where you home, you can always go home.
Oh, yeah.
And so for the longest time, that was kind of inbred in me. So I have dual now, but it's fascinating to me because I've been doing this work for so long, and I can kind of step back and see the beauty of, if we were to start to unpack some of these conversations, what could take place and what could take shape. And you touched on it too. Like, I've actually started doing a lot of my family ancestry. And, you have one thing kind of in mind, and then you start pulling out documents and you start pulling out, all of these things and going to the archives. And I was just like, this is such a fascinating story. Not only because some things did align, like I know I have Scottish background, but that Scottish background was solidified in that great grandmother and grandfather have a marriage certificate. Right. So it's like, wow, that tells a story. I think it was 1830 or 1836, something like that. And so you start to understand, okay, what was happening during those times? When you hear about revolutions, what was happening in history. So there's so much. And I always tell people, like, diversity, equity, and inclusion work isn't just HR.
Listen.
Right? It's not just HR. It is understanding anthropology. It's understanding sociology. It's understanding psychology. Like, it is understanding all of these things, because you have to understand how we got where we are in order for us to understand where we need to go. And so without unpacking some of this baggage that comes through that history and understanding the anthropology and all of those things, the socioeconomic things that were happening during that time, we can't ask for equity or reparations or any of those things without digging into the ugly stuff, right? And before I lose this thought, I think that's kind of what's happening right now. It was in the news. There's two families, but the one I think that most people will know is Benedict Cumberbatch, the actor, right? Cumberbatch was a huge plantation owner in Barbados. And so now people are asking for reparations from that family. And what does that look like? And it's kind of come out that his mother wanted him to change his name when he became an actor, so it wouldn't come back to him, right? The family history. So again, understanding. And I saw on TikTok, this young lady was able to trace her family roots back to the Cumberbatch plantation. Right. So when we talk about reparations and we talk about understanding what equity looks like and trying to rebuild, this is also part of the work.
Yeah.
And so, sorry, I could go on for days about this, but, I think, what I appreciate and love about you and the lens that you bring to this work is it's not just, this is my lived experience of being, from Trinidad and living in the US. Like, you lived in Japan, you lived in Belize, in South America. So you've seen this global perspective of what the other looks like or could be like, and how to shape how people experience that.
Yeah, it's definitely, in a perspective that even for me, I had to sit down and unpack. And I'm still unpacking. Let's be real about it. I'm still unpacking it, because just thinking about my time in not just in Japan, that was 10 years of my adult life, right? And very, the time in your life as an adult, like my like mid 20s into my 30s, right? Where you're learning and growing, and you're in this space that it's a very homogeneous society. And you have to learn for so much of my life, I was always the one. Even if in the high school I worked with, I was surrounded by, other English speaking teachers. We had a big department. It was about 20 of us. But guess who was the only Black person? Me. Who was the only person not from the global North? Originally from me, right? Who was, the person who walked the world in a larger body? Me. And especially in Japan, right? Who was the person who was allergic to shellfish? Like just these little things, right? That
Mm.
make you feel so othered
Yeah.
in a space that having that experience, but also not just having that experience myself, but also seeing others go through that experience.
The
And
empathy. Mm.
yeah, because my students were also from were also international. I worked in an
Okay.
international high school. So they were from international, mostly from around Asia. So from the Philippines, from Thailand, from
Okay.
South Korea, from China, right? And some from European countries. But so even with them, when they came into my class, they were sometimes together, but
Mm-hmm.
sometimes when they went off into their Japanese, their regular classrooms, they were usually a lot of the times the only, right?
Yeah.
So that perspective, when I started really, especially when I started digging into like program design and assessment, that was a big part of how, when you're building programs, and when I talk programs, I mean like educational programs. So I did a
Mm.
lot of building study abroad programs, right?
Okay.
And building programs for social enterprises, right? Especially in women and girls education.
Okay.
So when you're looking at things from that perspective, one of the things for me is that I I I guess my experience just has me questioning so many things that people don't really think should be an issue,
Mm.
right? So just to give you an example, I went to a conference last year, and I was speaking at the conference, and they had chairs for this. There were two stages. They had, on the bigger stage it was like nice little comfy chairs, and on the smaller stage it was like high chairs.
Okay.
So I was so happy that my talk was on the bigger stage, because in that room, that high chair, as someone who is 5'3" and in a larger body, I could not get up on that chair. I would have had to say, I'm sorry, I have to stand. I,
For
I
someone
just
that's
othered myself. I
5'2".
just felt like it,
That's a
right?
larger body.
I just
It's a
felt like
process. Yeah.
I don't belong. I already felt that. And
Yeah.
when you're planning an event, no one
Thinks about
no
those
one
things.
thinks about that. But I do,
Yeah.
because of all these little experiences, and not just the experiences, but also putting, like, it's like theory, practice, and like so it's like everything just
Yes.
combined,
Yeah.
that's just like I have to like unpack for myself, what does all of this mean
Mm-hmm.
for where I stand within this space, for where what I speak on, for like
Yeah.
it's such a I could
I
go on.
no, and it's like I totally appreciate that, because what I am hearing is this lens of equity and inclusion because of lived experience, right?
Mhm.
And so you see the world, when you see the world as an only, or you see the world from a perspective of who is not going to be included, or who's not going to have a good experience, versus I just want to do this event so I could get this event done, right? It's a
Yeah.
different way of doing it. And
Yeah.
and I say that, I led inclusion marketing for a large company, and that was something my team was very, very um, diligent about,
Yeah.
right? It's like, do we have ramps for our stages?
Yeah.
Do we have chairs that are accessible? Do we have different options, seating options? Do we have seating options at a reception? right?
Yeah.
We wanted to think through like who could potentially come through this space and the experience that they were having based on who they were, right? We didn't want to have people asking for accommodations. We wanted to be very proactive in that, even in having ASL interpreters available without people asking for it. So I appreciate, what you're saying, because the other thing that came to me when you said about the high chairs on the stage, I'm like women in dresses and the height of that.
Yes.
Oh, no,
Also.
no, been there.
Yeah.
So, those are the things though that you think about when you have lived experience as someone that's been in other, because you want to make sure that no one else has that similar experience. So, Abbiola, I want to do a little bit of a pivot.
Yeah.
We've been, going on and on and on and on. And I just love this conversation. This work is challenging, as we've been saying, and a lot of unpacking for self and for others and helping them unpack and get through some ugly truths. And so how do you take care of yourself? How do you fill your cup as you're doing this work?
Yeah. I one of the things I always tell anyone who says to me, "Hey, I want to become an entrepreneur or I want to become a DEI practitioner," I'm like, get a therapist.
Yes.
It's my first.
Yes.
Sorry. Get a therapist.
Yes.
Please.
You can't do this by yourself.
You can't do this by yourself. Like your friends are great to like bounce. Yes. Get a professional to help you through. So that's my therapist keeps me she keeps me in line. She keeps me so one of the things is like for me, I sometimes need that tough love. And she gives me that. And that helps me to get out of my head in certain ways and unpack things that I really don't want to unpack. Because if you leave me to do it on my own, I won't do it. Right? So having that person there to say, here, this is what we're working on this week. You said this is an issue. Like I need that. That's one thing for me that it's a non-negotiable. Like it has to be. It just is.
I love
right?
it.
So, and the other thing I would also say for me, and this may come as no surprise, but as a Caribbean woman, it's music. Like I need it in my life. And a lot of the times it is going to be like calypso and soca music just fills me with the joy that you can't even understand. And I listen to all different types of music, but if like when I need that boost, some Marshall is some Kess. Let's go. Some Patrice, some Alison Hines up in there. Right?
Listen, you're speaking my language.
Soca all day, every day.
Yeah, speaking my language. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's just a necessity. And also I read a lot. Like a lot. And yes, I read, the the nonfiction, the books for work and stuff like that. But I also read my little romance novels. Something just to take you away.
Yeah.
Just to take you away. And I've done that since I was a kid. So I read pretty fast. So last year I read like 89 books, and that was like a low year.
I need to catch up.
It's just it's just like I always have a book. So yeah, those are basically the three things for me that help me just like, other than like family and my nephews and my niece, you know what I mean? But those three things are non-negotiables in my life.
I love it. I love it. Yes. And I'm down for this. Anytime you come in here, usually I'm like, that little thing device over there, because if I say the name right now, it'll come on. Play some soca radio, and it's on. So I'm right there with you. So Abbiola, thank you so much for being with us today. Like I said, we could have gone on for hours with this conversation because I think it's just so much, again, to unpack as you do this work outside of the U.S. and trying to do so with a lens of coming in with different perspectives and how we see the world. And so I truly appreciate that. If people wanted to get in contact with you and work with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, the best way to contact me is probably through LinkedIn, right? Just look at my name, Abbiola Ballah, and you can also check in with me on my website, foreineducationstudios.com. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And everyone, thank you all for tuning in on this episode of DEI After 5. As always, you can catch us here on Tuesdays at 5:15 p.m. Eastern on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. All right, I'll see you next time. Have a good one.